So in the last video, I talked a lot about how we're going to validate those input arguments. So let me go ahead and show you how we're going to do that, and it'll also help me to show you the next thing that we need to talk about, which is how we're going to import the random module and then set the seed for that. I'm going to start off, as I always do, with new py. Now, new py for me is found if I say which new py. It's going to be installed. For me, I always like to create a .local bin directory in my home directory for installing my local programs. So that's where I put my program, and this location, um, this directory is in my path. So if you could go back and look at those early chapters to understand about your path and how to install that, so that what I want is just to be able to type new py from any directory wherever I am on my program, on my system. I want to be able to type that and not have to remember and manually type in the path to that program. I put that somewhere already in my path so I can just use it. So I'm going to say new py, and the name of this program is abuse.py. And when I do that, I now have an abuse program, and I'm going to say create insults, be fine. Um, and I'll put that here as well, create insults. Now this program does not take any positional arguments, so we can get rid of that. It does not take a string argument, but it does take two integer arguments, and this is the first time that we've used an integer argument. The first of it is going to be -n and number, and this is going to be the number of arguments. The number of insults. And by default, that's going to be 3. And the type for this is int. Now, it's not int in quotes. It is int, the class int, the actual Python class integer. The metavar here could be int. It could be, number. Int is fine. We don't have files or flags for this, so let's get rid of that. And before we make too many things, we'll just say print hello for the moment. And what I want is to just run this. Does this work? Abuse with -h. There. It does run. It has my optional number of arguments for n, or the number of insults. We're also going to need one for the number of adjectives. I'm going to change this to A. This is going to be called adjectives. The number of adjectives per insult. And that number is going to be 2. And the last thing that we need is a random seed, a seed value. That's going to be S and -- seed. Random seed value. Seeds can be strings, they can be numbers, they can be anything that is hashable and immutable. So I happen to like to use integers. The tests are written expecting that you're using an integer value, but you could use a string if you want in your own programs. But for the purposes of this, for these tests in this program, it does need to be an integer value. The default, however, is going to be none. So we're going to default to having no seed value, and only if the user supplies something will it be set to something at all. The way that, okay, so, well, before we continue on with that, I want to talk about validating the arguments. So rather than just returning the parsed arguments, you can handle this in the main. You can't handle this in the main if you're going to use parser error. You could validate and try to do all this error checking yourself if you want in the main, but it's so much easier to do this inside get_args and to use the argument parser, and I'm going to show you how. Just before I forget, I'm going to return args here. I want to say if, and I have the code here. I can just actually copy it. I'm going to copy this code just to go a little faster for the video. And what I'm saying here is that if the number of adjectives is less than 1, I'm going to call parser error with this message that the adjectives, and I always like to give feedback to the user so they know what value it is I'm talking about, that this value must be greater than 0. I'm going to save that and I'm going to run this. I'm going to make sure that I still run. Yes, these look good. And let's give the number of adjectives to be -3. Great. Okay. So it has no attribute adjectives. I call it adjective. So I need to change that to adjectives. Great. Now we see that the adjectives -3 must be greater than 0. I need to do the same thing because number is not set that way. Number still works. So we need to do the same check for the number. Change this to number, number, number. Save that, and let's run it. And now we see the same thing. Let's run our tests and see how we're doing. Because I know that I programmed in tests specifically for bad adjective and bad adjective number. Oh, the other thing that I coded here was giving bad adjective. I gave it a string value. So let's try to give it a string and see what we get. Let's run number or adjectives with the value foo. And this right here is pretty much almost sums up why you should be using argparse or something like it. We didn't write this check. We didn't have to say, please verify that it is an integer value and create this for us. Well, I guess we did because right here we said type equals int. And so we get that for free. If the user gives us something that can't be parsed as an integer for the -a, then it gets rejected because that's not something that argparse is able to convert into an integer value. It would be the same too if I ran this with 3.14. That's not an integer. It's a number, but it's not an integer value. Only if that is something that looks like an integer will this work. So that is just really fantastic. That saves you so much writing and so much validation of the input from the user that I hope that I've convinced you now to move all of your coding over to using argparse or something like it. And one of the things I like about argparse is that it's always installed. It's extremely standard. Almost every Python programmer I could imagine would be able to read this and understand it very, very clearly. This is extremely clean code and it works very well. So please use argparse. The last thing I'll say in this video is how we're going to incorporate using the random seed. So the first thing we're going to need to go do is come up here and I'm going to import random into my program. Now that I've imported, and again, random is a standard module, we don't have to install this. So once I've imported random, I can now use functions in the random module. And the one that I'm going to use here is I'm going to say random seed, and I'm going to pass it the args.seed value. And I can do this because the default value for the seed is none. So if I set the random seed to be none, it's the same thing as not setting it at all. And if there is a value for the seed, like 2, then I'm setting it to 2. So that's really handy. Now I have, in just very, very little lines of code, very few lines of code, I have validated that this is an integer value, I've set it to none, and I set my random seed. And going from here forward, this will help us to control the randomness of our program. And we'll talk about that next.